rock architecture, bamboo paintings, body swapping, nightmares, space travel, and romance. How does it all come together in Yumi and the Nightmare Painter? And how does Yumi and the Nightmare Painter stack up against other entries in Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere? Let's discuss. Welcome to the Pop Docs channel. I am Joseph, one half of the Pop Docs, jumping back into the Cosmere with another book review. In this video, talking about Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. This is the second of the Secret Project Cosmere novels, the third of the Secret Project novels in general. We have one more left to go, another Cosmere novel, which I am very much looking forward to. However, before we get into speculation and thinking about and what we hope to see in that fourth Secret Project novel, the third of the Cosmere novels, in this video I want to talk about Yumi and the Nightmare Painter because I am a huge fan of the Cosmere and I just finished reading this particular novel. And I want to talk about, as I always do, some of the things that I liked in the story that worked for me. These are my yays. And some of the things that didn't work for me in this particular novel, those would be my nays. And so my yays and my nays will take up the majority of this particular video, this particular review. But before jumping into my own perspective and how the story came together, or didn't, as the case may be for me, I want to give everyone out there a brief synopsis of Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. Drawn from Dragonsteel itself, here is the very terse synopsis for Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. Yumi comes from a land of gardens, meditation, and spirits, while Painter lives in a world of darkness, technology, and nightmares. When their lives suddenly become intertwined in strange ways, can they put aside their differences and work together to uncover the mysteries of their situation and save each other's communities from certain disaster? As with my other reviews, this is going to be as non-spoiler as I can make it. However, before jumping into my yays and nays, I do want to add a little more context to this particular story to add on to that synopsis that we can get from Dragonsteel. Mainly, what are the situations of our two main characters, Yumi and Painter, as he goes by in this particular novel, his name actually being Nakaro in the novel. And there's some elements of the story where he switches back and forth between Painter and Nakaro. I'll probably refer to him as Painter throughout this review, as that's the modal name that he utilizes, or modal title that he utilizes. And it comes from his particular job. He is a nightmare painter, as the title of the novel kind of implies. But in Painter's world, in his community, as it's described in the particular synopsis, it's a relatively modern, technologically advanced society, community, city, particularly relative to other communities we've seen in the Cosmere writ large. They have what amounts to TV, they have trains, they actually have the means to engage in space travel in this particular novel. So much more of a technologically advanced society than we've seen in other Cosmere novels, but they are completely encapsulated and shrouded in a shroud of darkness. And from this shroud of darkness at different periods of time, there are these shadow creatures that emerge from the darkness to try and feed on the dreams, ideas, fears, emotions of the residents of Painter's community, of his city. The Nightmare Painters, and there's a whole cadre of them, go out, seek out these shadows in different forms. So there's actually different levels of evolution to shadows that emerge from the shroud. And all this is detailed very, very early on. You get a lot of the mechanics of the city, the shadows, the Nightmare Painters early on. So I don't think this is necessarily spoilery in any real substantive way. But essentially, the Nightmare Painters go out, find these shadows before they can coalesce into this corporeal type being that actually can inflict physical injuries upon the residents of Painter's city. And they essentially banish these shadows back into the shroud by painting them in some form that's more docile. And so for Painter, what he typically does is he paints these shadows as some kind of bamboo structure or picture. And this essentially captures the essence of the shadows and then propels them back into the shroud. In a completely different setting, community, world, we have Yumi, the other half of the pair that the story centers around. And she is a chosen individual who goes from town to town in this particular world and essentially communes with the spirits of this particular world through stacking of rocks into very intricate designs and towers and the like. And by communing with the spirits through her particular art, she is able then to ask these spirits to become different types of tools or necessities that people in these different communities need to survive in what really amounts to a fairly harsh, potentially, environment where it's very difficult to engage in traditional agriculture as we understand it. And so in both worlds, both characters are utilizing their own unique artistic abilities as essentially the magic systems of this particular Cosmere world in order to fulfill some essentially job that is necessary for the maintenance and survival of their respective communities. And then early on, as the synopsis kind of suggests, these two become entangled. And essentially it turns into kind of a body swap story where part of the story is taking place in Yumi's world with the two characters, and then part of the story is taking place in Painter's world with the two characters, and the plot goes back and forth between both of these characters. And I won't go into any more detail because, as I said, that is essentially all covered in the first 20 to 50 pages of this particular story. But I think it's relevant context to add on to the synopsis we get from Dragonsteel, which certainly relative to other Cosmere stories, I think is a very terse synopsis description of the particular story. But with that background in mind, let me turn first to my yays, the things that worked in this story for me personally. And the first thing, which is probably not a surprise to those that have seen some of my other reviews on this channel, and I've reviewed several entries from the Cosmere, including Tress of the Emerald Sea and Elantris, that you can check out if interested on this particular channel. But world building. And I think this is one of the great strengths of Mr. Sanderson is he creates such interesting and indelible worlds that you just want to spend more time in to experience these different worlds and these different environments with the characters that we're following in each of his, particularly Cosmere stories, as I've only ever read his work that's been done in the Cosmere outside of the Wheel of Time, exempting his 3 books in the Wheel of Time series, which were great, parenthetically. But going back to the Cosmere, going back to Yumi the Nightmare Painter, once again, I think he really describes and creates a wonderful set of worlds for us to find ourselves lost in while reading this particular book. And in particular, I think Painter's world is particularly fascinating. And I think in part this arises from my own desire to have more cyberpunky or urban type fantasy to juxtapose from a lot of the more traditional epic fantasy that has more of a kind of medieval motif, medieval veneer. And although I like a lot of those stories, I do like to change it up with these different environments and also modernize a lot of the fantasy genre and start to think about how magic in particular would manifest and be dealt with and be handled and be approached in more technologically advanced communities, nations, societies, cities, etc., and these urban fantasy environments. And so I was really drawn to Painter's world. In fact, the chapters, when we would go to Yumi's world, I actually was less inclined to read because I wanted to spend more time in Painter's world with these characters, see more of his world with these characters. And in fact, there's one particular chapter in Painter's world between Painter and Yumi, and this takes place roughly in the second half to the third act of the story, and I just absolutely loved it and wish we had more scenes there in that particular environment, in that particular location, because I think that was really where a lot of the world building was most interesting, most fascinating, and really shined in this particular story. Second, Cosmere connections. This book is laden, in my opinion, with Cosmere connections. And if you are a big fan of the larger Cosmere, I think you will like this particular story. And it goes far beyond what was in Tress. As in my review of Tress the Emerald Sea, I talked about how there were a bunch of Cosmere connections, but they were really more in the periphery, and they're really more Easter eggs than part of the general narrative of the story. And so that's why ultimately I think Tress the Emerald Sea is actually a good entry point for newcomers to the Cosmere, because I don't think any prior knowledge of the Cosmere is necessary to enjoy and understand Tress the Emerald Sea. That is not the case, in my opinion, with Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. If you are someone who has never read anything from the Cosmere, has no general information or background about the Cosmere, I think you're going to be lost reading this story, because the connections to the Cosmere, I think, are integral to understanding the dynamics of the plot in particular and the connection between the different characters in this particular story. And so it's a yay for me, because I really love learning more about the Cosmere in total. But if you are someone who has not had any experience in the Cosmere, read anything from the Cosmere, I think you are going to be very much lost in this particular book. And so ultimately, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, for me, would never be a recommendation for anyone trying to get into the Cosmere. And really, it's more of a story, in my opinion, because particularly these significant linkages to the Cosmere that really make this a story best suited for longtime fans of Mr. Sanderson's Cosmere and are sufficiently steeped in Cosmere lore, Cosmere terms, Cosmere worlds, Cosmere magic systems to have an ability to really discern the mechanics of what's happening throughout this particular story. So for me, it's a yay. For newcomers, it would probably be a nay, would be my assessment, my conclusion. Lastly, I think this particular story attempts to address several really interesting themes. One of the main ones, as the synopsis suggests, and as my contextualization of the synopsis hopefully also implies, is that art and artistic creativity and what the definition of art is, what art emerges from, what its meaning to viewers, observers, to creators is, its effect on individuals and communities and the world writ large. Everything about art is really, I think, a focal point of this particular book. And in fact, there are several asides throughout the story where Mr. Sanderson seems like, through his characters, is trying to essentially give a dissertation on his perspective of artwork. And I really did think that that was an interesting theme, and it was really interesting ideas that were offered in these kind of interludes that really made me think about what art is, regardless of what form artwork takes, as it certainly can manifest in a whole host of different ways throughout the world from different creators and the like. But it's one of several themes that I think were really interesting that he seems to try to address and talk about and provoke thought on, both in terms of certainly art, and then there are these other ones that I won't get into because I think they do get into spoiler territory. And so for those viewers that are thinking about jumping into Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, I'll leave those for you to discover on your own. But I think there are several really interesting ideas and themes that Mr. Sanderson's trying to tackle in this story. Ultimately, and this is going to hopefully segue me well into my nays, I think a lot of the discussion of these different themes, including the themes surrounding art, are really subordinated to this larger romantic plot. And in large measure, and I think this really comes out in the postscript where Mr. Sanderson's talking about some of the influences and his thought processes going into Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, was really focused on this romantic interaction between the main characters and seeing their relationship grow throughout this particular story. And I have to say, for me at least, the romantic plot between the two characters felt very cliche, and I think it had a lot of tropes that we've seen in prior stories, in different mediums. And so I really just could not get invested in the relationship between the main characters of this particular story, at least through that particular lens. I had a little more interest in how they worked together to try and solve the mystery of what was happening to them in this particular story. So there are aspects of their interaction I really did like. And then there were aspects, particularly as it came to the romantic elements of their growing relationship over the story, that I just had a difficult time getting invested in because of largely the cliches, the tropes. And then the second thing on my list of A is the pacing. For me, the first 2/3 of this book are a slog. I think it takes so long to get to what's really going on and ultimately get to there is the Sander Lanch, or at least kind of a miniature version of the Sander Lanch, or what I called in a previous video, the Sander Kano, because I think this is more so a narrative way that Mr. Sanderson creates all this pressure that ultimately erupts in the third act of his stories, at least in most of his stories. And you get that in Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. But for the first 2/3 of the story, which is really this focus on this tried and true budding romance between the main characters, and for me, it was just a slog to get through. And there were some moments where I thought about either jumping ahead or not finishing the story, because I felt they got a little repetitive at times. There wasn't a whole lot of activity going on. And there were certain moments. So I mentioned earlier in this video that there was one particular scene with the two main characters in Painter's world. And that particular scene represents the height of the romantic plot, the romance in the story. But I think it's rarer in the larger context of the plot than all these other mundane interactions that seem to get very repetitive after a while. So ultimately, I think the story spent too much time trying to build up this romance, this relationship, and then in the last 100 pages or so, just fly forward to the end of the story, and in such a way that the first 2/3 focused on this romantic subplot did not do, in my opinion, a good job setting up the actual dynamics of the plot, the last third of the story. And I think this is why we have my third nay, which is exposition dumps. There are multiple times in this story where the narrator, and just like Trust the Emerald Sea, this is narrated from Hoyd's perspective. Although in this particular story, Hoyd is less an active member of the cast and more a passive observer relating to some unknown listener, audience, what's going on in this particular story. But there are a lot of chapters in this particular novel that open up with Hoyd talking about something on his mind, something that is usually related to what's going on in the general plot of the story, giving his perspective both on the characters, the plot, as well as just general themes that are, at that point in time, the focus of the story. But there is a point going into the third act where several pages are Hoyd essentially telling the audience everything that's happened in the background that led to the third act. Because, in my opinion, Mr. Sanderson did not do a great job in this story setting up any of this in the first 2/3, because it was so focused on building the relationship between Yumi and Painter that it essentially avoided setting up all the different dynamics and mechanics of the third act. And so all of a sudden the third act arrives, and without this pages-long exposition dump by Hoyd, readers, I think, would be somewhat lost in what is happening and the dynamics of the two character storylines and how they are separate, how they interact, how they intersect, and ultimately leading to the conclusion of the story. And so I thought there was, to use the old cliche, the old adage, far more telling in this particular story than showing, which is also, I think, somewhat odd or rare in Mr. Sanderson's stories, because I think he always does a good job of showing and not telling. Or at least the ledger is more so on the showing side than the telling side. In this particular story, I think much more telling than showing. And I think that really detracted from the story, because I would much more have liked to see these dynamics seated more directly, more clearly throughout the first 2/3 of the story. And also, I think that might have affected and helped the pacing if he had split and devoted more time to the general plot mechanics and the world in greater detail, and pulled back a little bit from the relationship between the two characters. This leads me to another nay, which is Hoyd's narration. I didn't mind it in Trust the Emerald Sea, and in fact, I think it made a lot more sense. It was organic. It was built into the plot. And also Hoyd's asides in Trust the Emerald Sea, which oftentimes borders on the silly, the goofy, the absurd, the humorous, fit much better in the world of Tress in the Emerald Sea than it does here. And I just grew a little exasperated by the interludes and the asides of Hoyd and his discussion of the particular story. It just didn't fit. And his role in this story I also thought was a little silly. And I think this is also a trend, for me at least, in a lot of the more recent Cosmere novels, is that Hoyd seems to be taking on more of a silly, goofy, comedic type of role and is losing some of the seriousness that the character had in previous stories, particularly in the early Stormlight stories. And I hope that this isn't a trend that continues on into the future, because just like Trust the Emerald Sea, the humor in this particular story really didn't work for me. And it wasn't as on the nose, it wasn't as eye-rolly for me as Trust the Emerald Sea was, but it still was not working well for me in this particular story. Lastly, my last nay is I did not like this ending. One, it was rushed, as I mentioned a few moments ago, in terms of pacing. Two, it really felt like Mr. Sanderson subverted, undercut the original ending of this story. This story really has several different endings when you step back and think about it. And I thought the first ending really fit what was foreshadowed, really fit the themes of the particular story. It was a very, I thought, good ending for the arcs, particularly the two main characters, Yumi and Painter. And this story actually has two epilogues, which is also part of kind of the humorous angle. I think it's an attempt to try to inject, at some level, humor into the end of this particular story. And I just think that the epilogues, one in particular to this story, really undercuts and diminishes the overall ending of this particular story. And so for me, I was already on the fence and a little ambivalent about this particular entry in the Cosmere. The ending just supplanted for me this idea. This is for me the weakest Cosmere novel. There are some short stories that I think are weaker, but that might just be the format. But ultimately, in terms of the novels in the Cosmere, this is undoubtedly for me the weakest of them. And it's one I will be very unlikely to revisit in a reread down the road, unless it has significant ties to future Cosmere events and future Cosmere stories. And in large measure, that feeling emerges from the ending of this particular story. And I think it's supposed to leave readers on an optimistic note, on somewhat of a high. For me, it was just deflating. And it just seemed like it wasn't the right ending to the story he told. Of course, as with art, going back to the dissertation in this particular novel on art, it's in the eye of the beholder. It's certainly subjective. For me, it did not work. And so that really spoiled the rest of the story, what came before the ending for me. And I was very disappointed in the particular ending of Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. And that leads me to my rating and my final thoughts on Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. For me, I gave this a 5 out of 10, so 2.5 out of 5 stars, to do it by a Goodreads scale. And like I said, this is, for me, the weakest Cosmere novel that Mr. Sanderson has written. Having said that, it can be a quick read, especially if you get invested in the characters and their growing relationship. For me, it just didn't work. And so for, like I said, 2/3 of the story was a little bit of a slog. But it's not an onerous read, especially if, as I said, if you get involved with the characters' relationship. If you are a big fan of the Cosmere, I think there are a lot of interesting Cosmere dimensions that are buried in this book that are probably going to have some significant effect on the larger Cosmere down the road. So certainly for Cosmere fans, you've likely already read Yumi and the Nightmare Painter if you're a big Cosmere fan, but if you're not, certainly give it a try, particularly for those Cosmere connections. And who knows, the things that I have on my nays list may be things that you end up liking, and that is awesome. I don't want to be a deterrent for anyone thinking about jumping into Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. And it's certainly not a poorly written book. I think it's, as with Mr. Sanderson, he does a good job with plotting, does a decent job with character work, and he can write a really interesting story, even when, for me, a lot of things don't work. I still like jumping into the Cosmere. I still like reading about the Cosmere. And so, if I had to do it again, I would still pick up Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. It's just relative to the other stories he's told in the Cosmere, it certainly doesn't rank up there with any of them. And for me, it is my least favorite. And before closing out the video, I'll just reiterate one more time. For those that have not read anything in the Cosmere, have never visited the Cosmere, have no general information about the Cosmere, this is not going to be the story to start with. This is a story to hold on to and put down the list after you've gotten through certainly Mistborn Era 1, maybe Trust the Emerald Sea, Stormlight Archives, and the like. And so hold off on Yumi and the Nightmare Painter if you have not spent time in the Cosmere before the release of Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. That's a lot. I had some interesting thoughts, I hope, some strong feelings, some strong emotions on this particular book, which I think is one of the tasks of a piece of art, is to give rise to strong emotions in different ways. And so, like I said, there are some good things in the book that worked for me, a lot more that didn't work for me. But please, let me know what you thought if you've read Yumi and the Nightmare Painter in the comments below. Do you agree with my points? Do you disagree with my points? Where do you think Yumi and the Nightmare Painter ranks among Mr. Sanderson's Cosmere stories? With that, that is Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. And for now, the Pop Docs Clinic is officially closed.